You ever find yourself just struggling with things in general? Just seems to always be something that comes along, and about the time you think one thing is taken care of, then something else comes along, and it just seems like life is constantly throwing things at you. Well, I think the Apostle Paul probably felt the same way. I think he probably went through most of his ministry feeling like just everything was being thrown at him all the time. And as we get into things today, we're going to look down towards the end of the second letter that he sent to the church at Corinth. And then we're going to just kind of get a brief background as to what's going on overall, which includes even an understanding of what was taking place when he wrote the first letter. But we're going to pick up in 2 Corinthians chapter 12 at verse 6. Where we read, "Even if I should choose to boast, I would not be a fool because I would be speaking the truth. But I refrain so no one will think more of me than is warranted by what I do or say, or because of these surpassingly great revelations. Therefore, in order to keep me from becoming conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. But he said to me, 'My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong.'" So a little bit of a background here. If you would, the Corinthian church had been infiltrated by false teachers, as is indicated in his first letter, as well as in this second letter. And to kind of get an idea of how this so easily would happen, if you were to pull out a map and you'd follow Paul's journeys, you would find that Corinth is located in Greece. Well, what were the Greeks famous for? When Paul was in Athens, Luke made this side note, which was generally true of the Greeks as a whole, where he wrote, if you would, "All the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing but talking about and listening to the latest ideas." Okay? The Greeks were real big at listening to things and trying to adapt everything they heard, and they never really became overly committed to any one particular thing in general. And so you have what was known as the Greek philosophers, very famous, and seldom did they all even agree. And so you had all of these philosophies going around, and everybody was anxious to hear what the latest idea was, what the latest thing was, and it was very easy for confusing doctrines and philosophies to creep into the churches as a result. And so they, like the churches of Galatia, were being lured away from the truth. So as we're looking at these letters, we see these things taking place. And one of the things to understand is at this point in time is that Gnosticism was in its formative stages and was beginning to grow as well. I mean, there were some people who were claiming special revelations and having secret knowledge that only could be revealed to certain people. And therefore, Paul's teaching was incomplete or not even correct because he didn't have this special revelation. It was just for certain people. Others claim that Paul was not even a genuine apostle and was weak because of his change of plans that you see at the beginning of the letter. That he didn't come to Corinth when he originally said he was because he was afraid to face them. And so he wasn't really a true apostle. He was weak. And so throughout these letters, he defends himself. In this letter particularly, he defends his change of plans at the beginning. And it appears in this letter that for the most part, he's won the majority of the believers at Corinth over. But there still remain a few false teachers and their followers who are opposing him and slandering him and lying about him and trying to regain a foothold. And so Paul is hoping and praying that by the time they get finished with this second letter, that these individuals will be dealt with before he arrives so that he won't have to do it. He would prefer to come as a meek and gentle individual and just have everything already taken care of before he gets there. But he was prepared to deal with them boldly if necessary. And he discusses that at great length in the beginning with chapter 10. And he defends his ministry and his apostleship to help them understand that he is a genuine apostle. And Paul knows that as people will begin to read through his defense, that it's going to sound like silly boasting and arrogance. Albeit, he is comparing his ministry to those who claim to be more enlightened than he is there at the Corinthian church. And it is obvious by his boasting that none of those who oppose him have ever really suffered for the name of Christ. And so he elaborates at length on what he's endured. And in those passages, if you would, Paul also makes it very clear that he will deal with the opposition when he arrives if he has to. In defense of his divinely appointed apostleship, by making reference to visions and revelations, he makes it plain that God has spoken to him. And he also writes of knowing a man who was caught up to paradise and heard inexpressible things that no one is permitted to tell. And in the context of this letter, we know he's referring to himself as being that person who 14 years before had seen these visions. But he minimalized that by referring to himself in the third person, because if you would, the focus of his boasting is ultimately on God's strength and not his own. So, Paul's visions of paradise in many ways silences those who claim to have special knowledge that only they can reveal because, well, so I get the pages to come apart. The things he saw and heard were, if you will, things that no one is permitted to tell. And so in other words, he's saying if they've really had this kind of a revelation, they wouldn't even be talking about it. If this was really from God, they wouldn't be saying that, well, we can reveal this just to certain people, because Paul says these things were not permitted to be told if they really saw them. And so he immediately even discredits those who are claiming that special knowledge, the Gnosticism that is beginning to grow within their midst. And then he talks about his thorn in the flesh. Now, most scholars believe that the thorn in the flesh he was referring to was that Paul was losing his eyesight and they attribute that to that belief by what he said in Galatians chapter 6, if you would. See what large letters I use as I write to you with my own hand. In other words, he made it plain that I have to write with large letters, giving an indication he was probably losing his eyesight. And so most scholars believe that the thorn in the flesh he was referring to was he was starting to go blind, and he was pleading with God to take that away, to restore his sight so that he could be more effective. But everything he had to say about what he has endured, about his apostleship, about his teaching, was leading up to the final words of our opening passage where he said, if you would, that is why for Christ's sake I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, I am strong. See, he endured. He persevered. He taught. Everything he did wasn't because he was great or strong or a fantastic orator, but because, if you would, it was Christ's strength that carried him. In some passages, he even points out, he says, I didn't come to you trained to speak. Although we know that as being a member of the Sanhedrin and rising up through becoming a very prominent Jewish leader, that he would have had some training. But he counted that as nothing. And he understood and recognized that through everything going on in his life, that he was nothing without Christ and his strength. That it was Jesus who was getting him through. That leaning on him is what enabled him to endure the things that he went through. The shipwrecks, the beatings, the imprisonment, the going without food, the needing clothes, being cold. Everything that he faced and went through, he recognized that it was the strength of Christ that got him through those things. That he didn't do it on his own. Oh, it would have been very easy for him to go around and say, look at me, look what I did. Look how strong I am. Look how good a Christian I am. Look how faithful I am. And pat himself on the back. But he says, no. Those are my weaknesses. And if it hadn't been for Jesus Christ, I would have never gotten through them. It was in those times when I was struggling. It was in those times when I was feeling down. It was in those times when I was feeling abandoned that Christ got me through things. And so he understood that if he had gotten through everything without Christ, it would have meant nothing. And the Lord allowed the thorn in his flesh to remain to remind him that, if you would, Christ was all that he needed. My grace is sufficient. I'm all you need. Regardless of what he faced, and no matter how difficult the situation was, because, if you would, Paul found that he was stronger when he leaned on Christ than when he tried to be strong on his own. In other words, if you would, when he was weak and leaning on Christ was when he became the strongest. We've got so many people in this world today who are trying to be strong, who are trying to face things, and yet they are finding themselves more and more depressed, more and more alone, because they are trying to handle the things by themselves rather than turning to the one who can give them the strength and get them through the things that they are facing. And so why was it that Paul felt this way? Why was it that Paul was willing to boast in his weaknesses, if you would? Because it was Christ's strength, not his own, that was getting him through. And so many today need to understand that Christ's strength can get them through anything. That if we put it in God's hands, he can handle it. As he told the Israelites as it was bringing them out of Egypt, and they were grumbling and complaining, just like we do a lot, isn't it? Grumbling and complaining. We don't have this, we don't have that. We want meat, and God says, is anything too difficult for me? Is my arm too short that I can't handle it? God can handle whatever we give him, whatever we turn over to him and ask him to handle. And so the same is true for us. If you would, we become stronger when we turn things over to God and lean on Christ. I think one of the reasons we find so many of God's people struggling with depression today is because they're trying to handle things on their own, rather than turning things over to God and just letting him handle it, and understanding the peace that can come from that. Knowing that he's in control no matter what happens, no matter what the flow of things is, God is in control, and ultimately he will work things for the good of those who love him. It may not always follow the pattern that we want it to follow. It may not always have the end results that we want, but we need to understand that God knows best. And if we let him handle it, it's going to come out with the best outcome overall. Oh, we might grumble and complain about it, but eventually we'll come to realize that he does know best. And somehow the idea of being able to turn things over to God and let him handle them eludes so many believers. You know, it amazes me at how many people I have come in contact with who worship every Sunday. They love to sing the songs. They'll post all of the Christian memes out there. And yet when you talk to them, they're worried to death about things. I think at the heart of what the Apostle Paul is saying is, when I turn things over to Christ, I don't have to worry about them anymore. I let him take care of it. He lifts that off of me. He gives us his peace and his strength when we let him work through our weaknesses. And our weaknesses become our strengths for God's glory when we turn them over to him and lean on him. You see, everything that is going on in this world today, regardless of what perspective you're looking at it from, everything that is going on in this world, in this nation, in the world, wherever you may go, everything that is going on, ultimately God is going to be glorified. Ultimately, He is going to use it in such a way that He is glorified. And we need to understand that. He is in control. We can turn things over to Him and let Him take care of them. Our weaknesses become our strengths for God's glory when we turn them over to Him and lean on Him. Everything that's going on in our life, God wants to use for His glory, and if we will turn it over to Him, He will give us the strength that we need, and He will be glorified. So no matter what's going on in your life, no matter how difficult things may be, no matter how much life may be pulling you down, no matter how afraid you might be, no matter how stressed you are, no matter how uncertain the future may seem, no matter what you may be facing, turn it over to God and you will find strength and hope and peace, because you will find, if you would, His grace is enough. It's enough. Paul came to understand that through everything that he faced, including the thorn in the flesh. God's grace is enough. Jesus tells us in Matthew chapter 11, if you would, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." In other words, Jesus is saying, bring your heavy burdens to me, let me take your heavy burdens, and I will give you something light to handle in comparison. If you will turn it over to me, I will free your mind from having to think about it all the time and having to worry about it all the time. And I will get you refocused and redirected to something that is a little bit easier on you. And I will take care of the tough stuff. Just bring it to me. Just give it to me. Because Jesus wants to lift the burdens of this world off your shoulders and take away your worries. But for some reason, I think there are a lot of people that love to have the worries. I've come across them. It's like that's what they live for, something to worry about. They wouldn't know what to do with themselves if they weren't worrying all the time. And I wonder if it's because they've never known what life can be like if you're not worrying. How relieving it can be. How free it can feel. How peaceful it can be. They go through life with storms constantly raging within them instead of knowing the calm that Christ brings to the storm. That even in the midst of the storm, He can bring peace and calm. And that's one of the amazing things about the grace of God and leaning on Him, is the fact that no matter what's going on in our lives, we can still have peace and calm if we just turn things over to Him and let Him handle it and let Him deal with it. So Jesus wants to lift those burdens off of our shoulders and take away our worries. And that's why the Apostle Paul wrote that last verse in the opening passage, if you would, that is why for Christ's sake I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. In other words, when I have all of these things coming in around me, crushing me, and making me feel like I'm about to drown, I can just simply turn them over to God, and all of a sudden I feel the release. And the strength is there. It's maybe kind of like that idea, you're going through the day, and you're exhausted, you're worn out, and then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, you get that second wind. And you feel refreshed all of a sudden. It's kind of what we're talking about here. God giving us that spiritual refreshment that when we finally reach the point that we turn it over to Him, all of a sudden we get that second wind spiritually. Up until that point, we're battling, we're struggling, we feel like we're smacking our head against the wall. And we finally turn it over to Him, and all of a sudden there's that, we get the second wind spiritually. You feel drained? If you would, give it to Jesus. Do you feel uncertain or afraid? Give it to Jesus. Do you feel anxious about something? Give it to Jesus. Whatever you are struggling with, whatever you might be facing, give it to Jesus. Because you see, His grace really is enough. He can get you through it. He can give you the strength you need. He can give you that second wind spiritually. He can give you peace and calm in the midst of the storm. His grace is enough. It will always be enough. And the more we try to take things upon ourselves, the more we allow ourselves to worry about things, to try and fix things on our own, to try and deal with things, regardless of what they may be, whether we're struggling with things that have our minds consumed, or we're struggling with the mental confusion, or the finances, the family, jobs, whatever's going on. His grace is enough. It's always been enough, and it always will be. It doesn't guarantee that life is going to all of a sudden get easy. It doesn't guarantee that all of a sudden everything's going to go away. It doesn't guarantee that there's not going to be hardships along the way. The Apostle Paul understood that. He faced hardship after hardship after hardship. But yet through all of it, His grace was enough. And it is enough. As you read through the Scriptures, many times we think, well, that's giving it to God, turning it over to God. That's easier said than done. And yet, at times it is. But I think one of the things that Paul learned along the way, I think one of the reasons he enumerated all the different things he had been going through, that everything that he had faced, is that he found out along the way that the more you turn things over to God, the easier it gets to turn things over to God. Kind of that idea of a track record. Well, God got me through this, so I'll turn this over to Him. And wow, He got me through that. And then you turn the next thing over to Him. And all of a sudden, eventually gets to the point where it's automatic. Something happens, you just give it over to God. Sad thing is, there's too many Christians today that going to God's the last thing they do instead of the first thing. If you read through the Scriptures, when the early church faced something, the first thing they did was they got on their knees in prayer. Turned it over to God. Church today, sadly, it's usually the last thing they do. They wait until things are so out of hand, then they finally say, okay, God, now will you take care of it? And I wonder how many times God would like to audibly maybe say back to you, well, if you'd have just given it to me in the first place, you wouldn't be in this mess. You wouldn't be so crushed. You wouldn't be so exhausted. You wouldn't be so depressed from everything that's going on if you'd just given it to me in the first place. His grace is enough. Something comes along, something starts happening in your life, something starts feeling like it's closing in around you, you start feeling like something's pulling you down. Don't wait. Turn it over to God. Give it to Him right away. And I understand there are times that things happen in our lives that we start trying to give them to God, and we have to keep praying about it and praying about it because we have a hard time letting go of it. But don't give up. Keep giving it to God. His grace is enough. His strength will carry us when we don't have the strength to do it on our own. Turn it over to God. Do you have something you need to turn over to Him today? Do you need to put it in His hands and say, Lord, I can't handle this. It's pulling me down. I'm dwelling on it all the time. It's all I can think about. It hurts. It's pulling me apart. Lord, take it. Take care of it for me. And release me from the worry and the depression and everything I am struggling with. And put it into His hands. His grace is enough. Do you have something you need to give to Him today? Would you give it to Him?